What are the potential economic consequences of these sweeping tariffs for global trade?
Well, global trade is based on the idea that goods are generally produced where they use up the fewest resources, where they are cheapest to produce. And if everybody participates in that, then global production is most efficient, and therefore you get the most output from the world's resources. So when you start to put barriers in place to make it not possible to take advantage of that, then what is going to happen is global trade is going to diminish, and therefore global productivity is going to diminish. So the world is going to have a smaller output of goods and services to divide amongst itself. So we are going to see a global recession. We're certainly going to see a recession in the U.S., and we are going to see a global recession, and that means, a small open economy like Jamaica is going to feel the consequences of that, regardless of whether we get 10% more tariffs or not.
And please, Dr. King, go a little explain more about the impact, at least your assessment of this impact, how this 10% baseline tariff on all imports, not only Jamaica, but on all exports to the United States.
Sorry, what's the question?
What impact assessment? Just give me an impact assessment. How do you see that affecting the average Jamaican here?
Well, as I sort of just explained, what import tariffs do is it moves production from where it is most efficient. In the case of the U.S., it's going to move production from where it is most efficient to inside the U.S., where in many cases it is less efficient. So let's take, for example, his tariffs on cars and his overall tariffs. What Trump wants to do is to move manufacturing back to the U.S. But the reason why manufacturing left the U.S. in the first place is because the U.S. is not an efficient place. It is not a low-cost place to do manufacturing because wages are higher, because people in the U.S. they're higher skilled, and they can create greater value added by applying their skill to more value added parts of the production process. So the lower value added part, which is putting the things together, the manufacturing, moves somewhere else. By forcing that manufacturing back into the U.S., he's therefore going to manufacturing is now going to be produced at a higher cost in the U.S. And so therefore, resources are going to move from higher value added parts of the supply chain to lower value added parts, which is screwing things together. Anybody can screw things together. That don't take high skill. So the U.S. is going to have a recession. And therefore, you're going to have a global recession because things are now being produced where they are less efficiently produced.
Mm-hmm. And looking on then, Dr. King, this argument that the President Trump put forward that it will push more companies to manufacture goods in the U.S. Yes, that may be true, but then as you indicated, it's going to be more costly for those goods, correct?
Not only is it going to be more costly for those goods, manufacturing is now going to draw resources and investment away from where the U.S. actually has an advantage in producing higher value-added parts of the supply chain. Mm-hmm. So, one of the reasons why the U.S. takes farm workers from Jamaica is because it doesn't make sense for U.S. labor to spend its greater capacity, its more productive capacity, picking things off of trees. Mm-hmm. So that is actually a metaphor and an example of why certain production takes place in the rest of the world, and it's more efficient and a better use of resources for the U.S. not to have that production in the U.S. Right. Manufacturing is the same thing, just on a larger scale. So he's forcing production to take place within the U.S. borders where it is not the best use of resources.
Mm-hmm. But, and Dr. King, let's face it, this grand announcement today, based on everything that you're saying, do you foresee the president maybe walking back this announcement that he makes maybe a couple months down the line?
No, because the reason why President Trump always talks about tariffs is instituting tariffs. And a lot of his, this is not a surprise, He spoke about the value of tariffs when he was campaigning. He believes in tariffs because he believes in three factors that are fundamentally wrong. He believes that tariffs are paid for by foreign countries. He says that many times. He says that, he mentioned in his speech that one of the reasons why the U.S. introduced an income tax is because they lost the revenue from import tariffs. That is absolutely not true. Tariffs are not paid for by foreign countries. Tariffs are paid for by the consumer in the country that's doing the importing. So that's going to come as a shock to him. The second myth is that he thinks that tariffs attract investment. No, what tariffs do is it shifts investment from where the country has a comparative advantage to where it is less efficient. So it doesn't net increase foreign investment. And the third myth is that low tariffs are a favor that you do to other countries that then take advantage of you by sending goods to you. And again, that is also not correct. Low tariffs are a way for the country, the domestic country, to take advantage of other countries' natural advantages. But because he believes these three myths, he believes tariffs are a good thing in and of themselves. They were always going to come, and he's not going to roll them back.
And Dr. King, when it comes to the specific industries here in Jamaica that would most likely be hardest hit, what do you believe those would be?
Well, it's going to be anything that we export anywhere in the world, because this step in deglobalization is going to lead to a global recession. Then the U.S. is going to contract the most, but other countries are going to contract as well. And it means that they are going to be buying less of all of our exports, no matter where they are going.
Well, we definitely have to leave you there, Dr. King. Thank you as always for your insight. Dr. Damien King is the Executive Director at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI. Thank you for your time, Dr. King.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to take the break, and then when we come back, we're going to be joined by social and political commentator Dr. Karen Dunkley to weigh in on this matter. And she's also a member of the diaspora over there in the United States.
Situation after the Trump administration announced sweeping tariffs, 10% baseline to all foreign goods imported into the United States, and specific countries get hit with as much as in some cases 40%. We have with us now social and political commentator Dr. Karen Dunkley to discuss further. Good afternoon, Dr. Dunkley.
Good afternoon to you and your listeners. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Dr. Dunkley, just to say, your reaction to this announcement by President Trump, and what do you feel are the implications, not only for global trade, but here locally in Jamaica?
I think the reaction is interesting. So one of the things that's certainly happening in the United States is that the conversation is a constitutional one and an economic one, whether or not president can constitutionally impose tariffs. So we do know that under the U.S. Constitution, their Article 1 in Section 8, it gives the Congress explicit power to collect taxes and impose duties. And that authority constitutionally belongs to Congress and not the president. So there is that conversation that is happening right now, is to what extent can the United States president impose a tariff? To what extent does that continue to be legal? We do know that in some instances, we've seen that Congress can delegate this authority to the president. It's under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, I think, that allows for national security reasons, as well as under the Trade Act of 1974, which allows the President of the United States to retaliate against what they describe as unfair trading practices by other countries. So right now, as we look at what the tariffs will mean, I can tell you what the markets are saying. I think there's a constitutional aspect. The economic reaction is simply tariffs cannot be good for any economy. We see here, if you looked at what happened to the stock on both the S&P and the Dow, we see tremendous deficits, tremendous downturn. We know that tariffs, they said the more trade that a country does is the wealthier. It's proportional to wealth, right? So trade is proportional to wealth. The more you trade is the wealthier because you're exchanging goods and services. So economically, tariffs lead obviously to higher prices. As a consumer, I am most interested in what gets me the lowest price. And just in terms of the law of economics, that is going to become very problematic for an economy that really relies on so many existing trade relationships. One more thing just before we shift, of course, to Jamaica land we love, is if you look at what has happened, Mexico and Canada have had their tariffs delayed because they have promised increased border security, and the presidents of these countries responded fairly quickly around the worldwide tariff issue.
Right. Which leads me to my next question, Dr. Dunkley. Do you think that the Jamaican government and diaspora organizations should advocate for policy changes to protect Caribbean economic interests?
I think absolutely. In fact, we need to organize, and it's something that we have yet to become solidified in, is to organize a Caribbean lobbying group that is powerful, that is relevant and influential enough to really attack, to take on some of these issues. If it is that we had a Secretary of State visit where we were billed as the most like-minded partner in the region, to come on the heels of that a few days later to this 10% tariff, where we are a vulnerable island state, really vulnerable to what we're now going to experience as an external shock. So I think when you think about where our GDP lies in terms of remittance, in terms of tourism, absolutely the diaspora, as well as I think, quite frankly, the Jamaican government, I know they're thinking about this. They have to be strategizing around this. Jamaica exports over 60% of the goods that we export goes to the United States. And so when you think about the industries, or banana or manufactured goods, or bauxite or alumina, we have to begin to think about what is going to happen. Will it impact demand? Will higher prices now make our products obviously less attractive to U.S. buyers? And then we have to think about the profit margin erosion. You would be amazed how many people and persons I know personally, and these are business leaders in America, certainly in the Northeast corridor as well as in the West. And they are actually in favor of the tariffs because they're saying that it's about time to buy American and to focus on American, and that we should absorb the shocks of the tariffs as the exporter. So that is going to dip into profit margin and or will lead to profit margin erosion and just sector instability. So we have every reason to be concerned.
And tell me, Dr. Dunkley, you suggested that the power that Trump is using to impose these tariffs might not necessarily be constitutionally allowable. Do you see any potential pushback from the Congress in the United States? And further, do you see the ability for that lobbying on the part of the Caribbean to be effective in potentially getting some level of clemency from this action from the Trump administration?
I think that Congress will not. I think that they will refuse to pass the tariffs. I think because the tariffs are wholesale. Initially, when the president took on this, if you remember now, this is tariff 2.0 because this president started to implement and activate tariffs at the end of his tenure in his first go-round as president. So what has happened is there was this talking around China and China becoming this monster, this giant, that they wanted to limit and really stymie the impact of China in terms of its economic reach. But what we saw today was that the tariffs are wholesale to what they're describing in the United States as the friend and foe alike. So I think because of this, that Congress will certainly, through whatever machinations they decide to employ, that they will absolutely not support the tariff. Based on what we've seen, we've heard from the different Congress people now, here is where it gets interesting. Will those who can and should really deny the president? Because I don't think they will want to upset the base, and that is my concern with the Republican Party, is will they do what is right for the American consumer by not wishing to upset the base to deny the president the passage of this tariff? And so it's yet to be seen if they will have the courage to take on the president, to let them know that they disagree with the tariff and therefore will block the vote.
That is social and political commentator Dr. Karen Dunkley. Thank you for joining us, Madam Dunkley.
Thank you.
And earlier we also had with us Executive Director at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, Capri, Dr. Damian King. Well, time will only tell how this will impact global trade and what will be the reaction from, well, several countries across the world in retaliation to what the Trump administration has done today. I'm sure we'll not be hearing the last about this.
Certainly, indeed, Siobhan. Let's see what will happen as the days go by.
Well, listeners, that is it for the cover story. And when we come back from the break, we will now shift gears back to the Grace Kennedy the 35th annual public lecture under the theme Breaking the Cycle of Childhood Trauma. More after this.
Cover Story was brought to you by Hyundai. Modern,